A cold mist clung to the village as the storm approached, but the tension in the air was far heavier than the weather. In Nether Barrow, secrets weren't just whispered. They were buried, locked away in the hearts of those who feared the truth. And when it finally came to light, it shattered everything. What happens when the darkness you've hidden for so long finally escapes and threatens to destroy all that you've known? A mystery that began with one man's silence would soon reveal a legacy of lies and guilt that no one was prepared for. Miss Marple knew, no one leaves unscathed when the truth decides it's time to be heard. The village of Nether Barrow had long been known for its tranquil pace, where even the smallest of changes stirred murmurs of curiosity amongst its inhabitants. The arrival of a new postman, for instance, would dominate conversation for days, and any deviation from routine would have the townsfolk speculating behind drawn curtains. That particular May, with the wisteria clinging to the trellises and the bees drunkenly buzzing from flower to flower, the village's calendar pointed to one eagerly anticipated event: the annual garden party at Hazeline House. Nestled on the edge of Nether Barrow, Hazeline House was the stately home of Colonel Geoffrey Hargreaves and his much younger wife, Theodora, though most still referred to her as Miss Thea, as though clinging to a past where she had once been a mere presence in the village, rather than its mistress. This garden party had become a staple of village life, enduring despite 2 world wars, 1 disastrous flood, and a brief scandal that had involved a misplaced brooch and a disgruntled housekeeper. Tables, laden with sandwiches, trifles, and the Colonel's famed sponge cake, baked by no less than 4 competitive local women, groaned under their weight. The band from Little Dithering played a lively and uneven selection of waltzes, the sound floating into the warm air, while the chairs were meticulously arranged in sweeping arcs around the rose garden. Yet, amidst the symmetry of it all, one chair stood out, a high-backed wooden chair facing the north, isolated slightly from the rest, its back turned deliberately to the house, as if it held some unseen purpose known only to the person who had placed it. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted it immediately, not with alarm, but with a quiet curiosity that preceded deeper thoughts. It disturbed the perfect arrangement, but who would notice such a thing in the flurry of gossip and laughter that swirled around her? It rather spoils the arrangement, doesn't it? Mrs. Petherbridge murmured, lowering her voice as she fanned herself with the band's set list, her gaze flicking nervously toward the solitary chair. Someone really ought to move it. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it, a glint of something more than curiosity passing through her. Chairs, my dear, have a way of being placed for a reason, especially when they appear to serve no obvious purpose. Petherbridge sniffed, seemingly unimpressed, and turned her attention to a plate of seed cake, unaware of the tension that had already begun to creep into the afternoon. Guests milled about, exchanging pleasantries, while Lady Marbury whispered a tale of scandal into Reverend Locksley's ear, veiling it with charitable words. Mrs. Vale, the butcher's wife, seemed on edge, casting worried glances at her husband, who for his part, avoided her gaze entirely. Young Miles Hargreaves, the Colonel's estranged son from his first marriage, stood stiffly by the refreshment table, nursing his glass of lemonade with an expression far too serious for someone so young. Miss Marple, however, remained unperturbed, observing them all with the same steady gaze that had unraveled many a tangled lie. "It's strange," said a voice beside her. Theodora Hargreaves, her silken dress rustling like wind through reeds, glided over to Miss Marple with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That chair," she said, her fingers tugging at her gloves, as though they didn't quite fit. "I told them not to bring it out." She paused, a shadow crossing her features. "Geoffrey insists it belonged to his father. Swears it must face north. We all have our little rituals, don't we?" Miss Marple's lips curved ever so slightly. "Indeed we do, my dear, and sometimes, those rituals reveal more than we care to know." Theodora hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the chair. "Do you think it's—" She trailed off, unsure. "Oh, I don't know," Miss Marple mused, her gaze never leaving the oddly placed chair. "Ominous. Chairs rarely are, but people on the other hand." Before Theodora could respond, a loud shout rang through the air, cutting through the lilting waltz. All heads turned as a gardener, pale and disheveled, came stumbling from the orchard path, his hat clutched in his hand, his words tumbling over one another. "It's Colonel Hargreaves," he gasped, barely able to form the words. "He's the colonel," with the firm gait of a man long used to giving orders, strode forward immediately, his voice booming as he addressed the gardener. A ripple of tension passed through the crowd, a momentary hush falling over the gathering, as if the very air had thickened with unease. Miss Marple, however, did not move immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to the chair, her eyes narrowing with a contemplative intensity. The shadow it cast was sharp, harsh against the sun-drenched lawn. Her fingers brushed the armrest, warm from the sun, but there was something wrong, something faintly unsettling in the air around it. A familiar scent lingered faintly, sharp and bitter, like something long past its prime. By the time she reached the orchard path, the party had descended into chaos. A small crowd had gathered in a loose circle, and at the center, lying beside a fallen basket of apples, was a woman Miss Marple had not seen before. She was well dressed, middle-aged, with gloved hands neatly clasped in her lap, her face drained of color, her body positioned as though she had simply fallen asleep in the middle of the festivities. But Miss Marple knew better. Something darker had unfolded, and the truth was waiting to be uncovered. As the sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting long languid shadows across the lawns of Hazel Dean, the village of Netherbarrow had slipped into a strange quiet, broken only by the occasional murmur of anxious voices. The garden party, once a scene of laughter and light-hearted chatter, had dissolved into an unsettling stillness. A woman had collapsed at the edge of the orchard, her elegant form now lying motionless beside a basket of apples, and the guests, who moments before had enjoyed the feast of cakes and waltzes, now stood around her with hushed breaths. Colonel Hargreaves, red-faced and muttering under his breath, retreated to the safety of his study, while his wife Theodora had dismissed the staff early, her usually composed demeanor faltering under the weight of unspoken tension. Miss Marple, ever the observer, had not left, though she stood apart from the others, her gaze fixed upon the strange chair that had stood facing north, silent and odd, like a monument to forgotten secrets. The woman, now revealed to be a stranger to Netherbarrow, seemed out of place in every sense. She was not the type to simply wander into a private gathering, least of all one as closely guarded as this. The whispers had started immediately, and by evening they had turned into wild stories, each one more elaborate than the last. But Miss Marple, seated now in the quiet of Theodora's morning room, sipped her tea in silence, her mind already working. "I never saw her before," Theodora murmured, still shaken. "Not at the market, not at church, never even at last year's party, and yet she was there, as if she belonged. She even stood at the edge of the orchard staring at the house, like she knew it." Miss Marple's eyes drifted through the window, where the shadows of the orchard now stretched long and uncertain over the ground, and the chair, still facing north, seemed to loom in her mind, an enigma wrapped in ritual. She didn't need to be told about the significance of the chair. She had already noticed its peculiar placement. "Memories have a way of resurfacing," Miss Marple remarked softly. "If someone insists on digging, they always do." Theodora shivered slightly, and just as Miss Marple was about to speak further, there was a sharp knock at the door. Reverend Locksley entered, his face a study of restrained concern. "I've come to check on Mrs. Hargreaves," he said with a measured politeness. "And yourself, of course, Miss Marple." His gaze was firm but anxious. "The rumors, they're already starting to spread. The village is unsettled." Theodora's hands gripped the edge of her teacup as she looked at him, her voice almost a whisper. "We are too. The situation is unnerving." Locksley nodded, though his eyes were shadowed with more than the weight of his pastoral duties. "I understand. Word from the authorities?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual, though her mind was already several steps ahead. The Reverend's answer came slowly, as if weighed with uncertainty. "The police surgeon has seen the body. No wounds, no bruising, just heart failure, he says." He hesitated, then added, "But I've seen sudden deaths before, Miss Marple, and this doesn't feel like one." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, her fingers idly tapping the side of her cup. "Sometimes, Reverend, death leaves no mark, but it does leave something. something we all too often overlook. Her words, though softly spoken, seemed to hang in the air like an unspoken challenge, a hint that something far deeper lay beneath the surface of the day's events. As the night crept on, the village's whispers would only grow, but Miss Marple knew better. The mysteries of Netherbarrow had only just begun to unravel, and with every passing moment, the truth seemed closer, but more elusive than ever. The night that followed the garden party felt heavier than most, as if the very air of Netherbarrow was saturated with secrets it wasn't ready to share. The moon hung high, casting pale light over the cobbled streets, which seemed eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Miss Marple, however, was not one for silence, not when her mind was so abuzz. She walked with purpose through the village, her keen eyes noting the slight tremor in the air, as the murmurs of the day's tragedy continued to pulse through every corner. By the green, Miss Vale and her sister-in-law were huddled together in whispered conversation, the flicker of their voices cutting through the night like soft shadows. She said she was here to meet someone, Mrs. Vale was saying, her voice low, filled with an unsettling uncertainty. She asked about the north-facing chair, why it had to face that way. Gave me the shivers. Her companion responded dismissively, suggesting the woman was simply eccentric, though Miss Marple, standing unseen behind the hedge, knew better. There was nothing accidental in the way the woman had come to Hazeling, nor in the way she had died. She could feel it, the unspoken tension, the careful positioning of that chair, waiting as if it knew something everyone else had forgotten. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple removed her hat, settling into the familiar comfort of her favorite chair by the hearth. Her cat curled at her feet, a quiet companion in the stillness that filled the room. As she closed her eyes, the memory of the chair in the orchard returned to her, vivid in the dark of her mind. The deliberate placement, the way it seemed to beckon, and the deep sense of purpose it held, purpose that had not been of the woman's making. Miss Marple was certain of one thing. The woman had not wandered into the garden by chance, and her death had been no mere accident. Someone in the village knew why the chair had to face north, but they were waiting for everyone to move on, to forget. Miss Marple, however, never forgot. She never allowed herself to. The following morning broke crisp and cold, the fog of the previous night clinging to the windows, muffling the usual hum of Netherbarrow. Yet inside the village's quiet walls, the gossip had already begun. At the bakery, Mr. Dobbins leaned in close to Miss Nettie Prow, whispering about a brooch the dead woman had worn, a family crest, possibly French, with a lion. At the post office, Mrs. Entwistle claimed the woman had come in just days before to ask about a parcel, though no name had been provided. And in the general store, young Hilda Loxley, the Reverend's niece, was adamant that she had seen the mysterious woman arguing with an older man by the postbox just before the party. When asked for details, Hilda could only recall that the man had worn a hat low over his eyes, and the woman's voice, though quiet, had been laced with a quiet fury. The quiet kind, Miss Marple mused, as she placed a packet of barley sugar in her basket. The kind that's always worse. With that thought lingering, she left the store, her mind already racing. Instead of heading straight home, she turned down a narrow lane that led toward the back entrance of Hazeline House, the once vibrant garden now hidden behind the police's roped-off cordon. There were no officers standing guard, just a faded sign, and the remnants of a hasty investigation. Miss Marple ducked under the rope with ease, her movements fluid and practiced. The grass beneath the apple trees was trampled, the earth disturbed by the heavy footprints of too many boots. Yet there, in the center of the orchard, a small depression in the ground marked the spot where the woman had collapsed. The weight of the scene lingered in the air, and Miss Marple knew it. There was more to this death than mere coincidence. She could feel it in her bones, the stirrings of something far darker, something hidden beneath the surface. And as the village continued to murmur and gossip, she would uncover the truth. The spot where the woman's body had been discovered was marked by an unsettling quiet, as though the earth itself held its breath. Near the lifeless form, the basket of apples lay discarded, its contents bruised and forgotten, decomposing in the cool shade beneath the apple trees. Miss Marple stood motionless for a moment, absorbing the scene before her with the kind of stillness only years of experience could bring. Then, as though following some unseen pull, She walked the short distance between the basket and the rose garden's edge, her eyes scanning the area with practiced precision. From this vantage point, the north-facing chair was clearly visible, positioned in a way that made no mistake about its purpose. It was set deliberately, its back to the orchard, a perfect line of sight between it and the path leading to the house. As she circled around the chair, she lowered herself into it with deliberate care, her mind already piecing together the story this chair had to tell. From this angle, the view of the orchard framed the house neatly, offering a clear view of the main entrance, yet keeping the side veranda hidden from view. It was a perfect position for someone who wished to observe without being seen, or perhaps to remain unseen while waiting for something to unfold. The faint crunch of footsteps behind her broke her concentration, and she turned to find Inspector Crail approaching. His tall figure was outlined against the cold light of the morning, his voice carrying the tired, breathless quality of someone who had spent too many hours chasing the truth. "I thought I'd find you here," he remarked dryly, his gaze lingering on the chair. Miss Marple offered him a smile, as serene as ever. "You know how fond I am of chairs with peculiar alignments," she replied, her voice a soft hum against the stillness. Crail grunted in acknowledgement, crouching beside the chair to inspect it. "You're not the only one sniffing around," he muttered. "Everyone in the village seems to think they saw her last week. You'd think she was a performer in the town square." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze never leaving the chair. "She may have passed through several times unnoticed," she mused, "until she wanted to be seen." Crail examined the chair's arms, his fingers brushing over the polished wood. "No signs of damage or tampering," he reported, his voice low. "But we found something strange in the orchard. A powder of sorts, on the hem of her skirt. Dusty blue, almost like chalk. Sergeant Bell thinks it might be laundry soap, but we're sending it off for tests." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though she remained silent, waiting for Crail to continue. "The odd part," Crail added, "is that her gloves had traces of the same powder, even though she wasn't holding anything when we found her. Just her hands folded neatly, almost posed." Miss Marple let the words hang in the air for a moment, her mind running through the possibilities. "Or someone meant her to be posed," she said softly. Crail looked at her, a brow furrowing. "We're still working on identifying her. No handbag, no documents, and her pockets were empty. But the shoes," his voice trailed off as he gestured toward the high-quality leather, hand-stitched footwear. "London made. She wasn't a vagrant." Miss Marple nodded. "No, and she didn't wander in just for sponge cake." Crail dusted his hands off in frustration. "We're questioning the guests now, but I don't expect much. Polite lies are easy to come by in a village like this." "Sometimes it's not the lies that matter," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze drifting back to the chair. "But what people forget to lie about." Crail gave her a nod, though his mind was elsewhere. As he returned to his work, Miss Marple walked slowly back through the village, her thoughts sharpening with every step. As she passed the Vale residence, she paused, noticing Mrs. Vale in the yard, shaking out a tablecloth with unnerving vigor. When she saw Miss Marple, her lips twisted into a tight, forced smile. "Terrible business, isn't it?" she remarked. Her voice clipped. "Quite so," Miss Marple replied, though her mind was already several steps ahead. "Odd though," she continued, her tone casual. "I was told the woman asked about the north-facing chair." Mrs. Vale's hand stilled for a brief moment, her gaze flickering with something unreadable. "Did she?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I wouldn't know. I hardly spoke to her." "But you did see her?" Miss Marple pressed gently. The pause was barely noticeable, but Miss Marple caught it. "Lovely dress," she added. "Gloves too, though I noticed they were slightly frayed at the seams." Mrs. Vale blinked, then quickly resumed her work, her movements sharper than before. "Must have been old. Or borrowed," she muttered, not meeting Miss Marple's eyes. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, borrowed. Perhaps." As she continued on her way, her mind wove the invisible threads of the case together. Orchard paths, borrowed gloves, dusty powder, and a chair placed with far too much intention. A pattern was beginning to emerge, though it remained clouded in uncertainty. Someone in Netherbarrow had watched that chair, not with nostalgia, but with purpose. The question now was who, and why. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the sitting room of Hazelden House, where the quiet hum of conversation was interrupted only by the occasional sound of a teacup being set down, a chair shifting, or the deliberate scratch of a pen on paper. Inspector Crail, a man whose patience had long since been tested by the tedium of too many interviews, worked with a quiet intensity as he took statements from the guests. Sergeant Bell, standing just behind him, nodded absently, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced indifference of someone long accustomed to the monotony of routine. Meanwhile, Theodora Hargreaves moved about the room with the grace of a hostess well versed in the art of maintaining an air of composure, though the slight tremor in her hands as she poured tea was a telltale sign of nerves beneath the surface. As Miss Marple sat in her corner armchair, crochet needle in hand, her eyes never stopped moving. Beneath the pretense of idle crafting, she absorbed every word, every gesture, every nuance. She was watching, listening, waiting for something to click into place. Mrs. Vale was the first to be questioned, her words a broken record of disinterest. "I hardly noticed her," she repeated, for what felt like the third time, her voice thin and defensive. "She wasn't part of the party. She just blended in. Looked like someone's cousin from the city, if you ask me." Crail's voice was steady, his gaze never wavering. "And you didn't speak to her?" "No," Mrs. Vale replied, almost too quickly. "I was busy helping with the tarts." Miss Marple looked up from her work, her gaze sharp and deliberate. "The powdered sugar," she said, almost absently. "You used it on the custards, I expect." Mrs. Vale blinked, the slight falter in her expression not going unnoticed. "Yes," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Bluish, wasn't it?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, yet knowing. "Pardon," Mrs. Vale stammered. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "I noticed a touch of residue on your apron yesterday," she said, her voice light, as though speaking of something entirely innocent. "I thought it unusual. Perhaps food coloring." Mrs. Vale's face flushed, and she swallowed once, clearly uncomfortable. "Perhaps the icing sugar was off," she mumbled, her voice almost inaudible. Crail made a note, but he didn't press further. When Mrs. Vale left, Theodora moved to refill his cup, her movements graceful but hurried. "She's harmless," she murmured, her voice lower now, as though they were sharing a secret. "Overly fond of attention perhaps, but certainly not capable of anything sinister." Miss Marple did not reply. Next came Miles Hargreaves, his arms crossed defensively as he sat down, his eyes constantly darting to the door. "She wasn't supposed to be there," he said suddenly, his words sharp and almost accusatory. "I saw her arrive. She didn't come through the front like the rest." Crail's eyes narrowed slightly. "Where did she come from?" "The orchard path," Miles replied, his voice wavering just a little. "From the west gate." Crail paused, his gaze fixed on the young man. "Do you know her?" Miles hesitated, his lips pressing together in a thin line. "No," he said, after a moment, but then added, "Well, maybe." She looked familiar, like someone I've seen in London, but not personally. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her eyes calculating. "And you didn't approach her?" she asked, her voice soft. "No," Miles replied quickly. "She looked like she was waiting for someone. I didn't want to interrupt." "Did she look anxious?" Crail asked, his voice steady. Miles paused, his brow furrowing, as he searched for the right word. "No," he said finally, determined, like she knew where she was going. When Miles left, Crail exhaled slowly, rubbing his brow as though the weight of the investigation was finally starting to wear on him. "That's 3 people now who claim to recognize her, but none who admit to knowing her," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "Remarkable. It's often easier to recognize a threat than to admit its origin." Miss Marple murmured, her tone thoughtful. Crail glanced at her, his eyes narrowing as if considering her words for the first time. "Do you think she came to meet someone at the party?" he asked, his voice low. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately, instead resuming her crochet with methodical precision. "I think she came, knowing exactly where the chair would be," she said at last, "and that she would not have to search long to find the person she sought." Crail's brow furrowed. "And you still believe this chair matters?" Miss Marple's smile was almost imperceptible. "Oh yes," she replied softly. "In villages like this, we do not place furniture without meaning." The afternoon wore on, each new guest offering a piece of the puzzle, but none of them seemed to provide anything of substance. A seamstress who had noticed the woman's oddly stiff posture, an elderly man who claimed the woman had spoken with Theodora at length, yet neither had seen her leave the chair, nor could they explain how she had vanished. It was as though the woman had been swallowed up by the house itself. Only the gardener's accidental stumble upon her lifeless form had broken the spell of indifference. As Miss Marple walked back toward the green, her mind began to sharpen. Passing by the village shop, she paused, her gaze fixed on the window display. There, amidst the usual trinkets and preserves, something caught her eye. A thread, thin but undeniable, pulling everything together. A pattern was emerging, one that held a story the villagers had yet to tell. And Miss Marple, with her quiet patience and unerring intuition, was the only one who could see it. The pieces were there, scattered like breadcrumbs, waiting to be found. But the question remained, who had laid the trail? A low, persistent mist had settled over Nether Barrow, twisting around the narrow lanes like an invisible thread, binding the village in an eerie silence. The residents, as usual, had gathered in their tight-knit circle by the village shop, exchanging whispered theories, and watching the world through half-closed curtains, their minds far more active than their limbs. Gibbons, the retired railway inspector, was the first to speak, his voice carrying a weight of suspicion. "She was asking about Colonel Hargreaves," he said, pausing to glance around, lowering his voice as if the very air was listening. "She told me she was an old acquaintance. Seemed flustered when I asked her name." Mrs. Pitherbridge, adjusting a row of biscuit tins on the counter, stiffened. "Why would anyone lie about knowing the Colonel?" she murmured, a frown tugging at her lips. "Everyone knows him." Mrs. Entwistle, knitting furiously, added with a shudder, "She wasn't lying. Mark my words. She came here with something unfinished, something dark." Miss Marple, standing quietly at the back, allowed her eyes to flicker toward the shop window. A mannequin, draped in a coat of soft leather gloves, caught her gaze. They were identical to the ones the woman had worn. A simple placard beneath read, "New shipment from London, Finch and Bramwell Est, 2. The gloves, however, were anything but ordinary. Finch and Bramwell was a high-end discreet brand, known for being sought after but not easy to find in small villages like Nether Barrow. Miss Marple stepped inside, her every movement measured and deliberate. Behind the counter, young Elsie Perks greeted her with a nervous smile. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple." Miss Marple returned the greeting, her eyes narrowing slightly as she noticed the gloves. "Lovely stitching," she commented. "I see they've just arrived." Elsie, her voice faltering, nodded. "Yes, last week, special order." Miss Marple's curiosity piqued. "And by whom, dear?" Elsie hesitated before lowering her voice. "That's the strange part. No one claimed them. The order was made under the name M. Hargreaves, but Mr. Miles swears he didn't place it." A spark of realization flickered in Miss Marple's eyes. Miles Hargreaves. The initials were far too precise to be a coincidence. "Perhaps someone wanted him to have them," she murmured, her voice as soft as a passing breeze. She purchased a box of tea, leaving Elsie to wonder at her odd comment. But Miss Marple had already turned toward the door, her mind racing. The woman in the orchard had worn gloves from a brand that she should never have had access to in Nether Barrow. Gloves ordered in the name of Miles Hargreaves. It was clear that the woman was no stranger to the Hargreaves family, but the question was why she had taken such elaborate steps to plant herself in the web of their secrets. As the mist thickened outside, Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward. The wrong people were beginning to appear guilty, and in a case like this the more guilty someone looked, the more likely it was they weren't. The next morning, the village was wrapped in the same uneasy fog. Theodora Hargreaves arrived at Miss Marple's door early, her face ashen beneath the veil of her wide-brimmed hat. "I've just come from the police," Theodora said quietly, her voice trembling. "They've confirmed the woman's identity." Miss Marple motioned for her to sit, her hands folding neatly in her lap as she listened. "Clara Denham," Theodora continued, her voice faltering slightly. "She was registered at the Red Fern Inn, booked under her real name. Came 3 days before the party, alone, and paid in cash." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to her, noting the unease in her voice. "She came prepared then," she said, her tone thoughtful, "and she didn't intend to stay long." Theodora hesitated before speaking again. "There's something more." Colonel Hargreaves knew her. The revelation hung in the air like a dark cloud. He admitted it this morning, said she was his first wife's cousin. They hadn't spoken in years, but he knew her. She'd been unwell, some time in an institution. Miss Marple's mind turned over the name, Eleanor, as if it was a key to a locked door. "Eleanor," she repeated softly, her voice almost a whisper. The mystery deepened, but Miss Marple's sharp mind was already turning, calculating the next steps in the quiet game she played with fate. Something was stirring in the village of Netherbarrow, something that no one had yet dared to name. Theodora Hargreaves' hands trembled ever so slightly, the weight of old grief pressing upon her as she spoke of her late husband's first wife, Clara Denham. "She passed 15 years ago," she said, her voice tight and distant, like a woman lost in a storm of memories. "A tragic fall from the upstairs landing. They called it an accident." Miss Marple, ever composed, folded her hands with measured grace, but her eyes, sharp and assessing, betrayed her thoughts. She did not speak immediately. The silence between them grew thick, like a fog creeping in, as the pieces of the puzzle began to shift in Miss Marple's mind. "Clara Denham returns now, after all this time, to speak of unfinished matters," she murmured, her words more to herself than to Theodora. Theodora's breath caught in her throat. "Yes, she appeared at the garden party, just like that, like a ghost," she faltered. Why not come to the door? Why hide herself in plain sight? Why play the part of someone forgotten? Miss Marple didn't immediately respond. Instead, her gaze drifted to the bookshelf across the room. There, a single volume leaned askew, as if disturbed by some invisible force. "Some people prefer to observe before they confront," Miss Marple said softly, her voice almost as quiet as a whisper, "especially when they fear they will be unwelcome, or worse, silenced." Theodora's discomfort was palpable, her face flushing with the weight of the secrets now spilling from her lips. She stood quickly, as if to leave behind the things she'd said, though a part of her was reluctant to go. "I shouldn't have said so much, but I thought you should know," she murmured, her voice trailing off as she made her exit. Alone, Miss Marple's mind turned over the fragments of conversation. She returned to her chair, the quiet rustling of her notes filling the room. Her handwriting, small and precise, filled the margins with new thoughts, new connections. Clara Denham, first wife's cousin, uninvited at garden party. She underlined that last note with deliberate care. Beneath it, another thought began to take shape. Chair faces orchard. Orchard faces house. Powder found blue, possibly chalk or soap residue. Soap residue. It rang in her mind like a bell. This small detail, something she had overheard at the church just days before, now felt strangely significant. She needed to follow this thread. The missing handkerchief. Mrs. Finch, the vicar's housekeeper, had mentioned it in passing, dismissing it at the time as idle village gossip. But now, it felt like a clue too sharp to ignore. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, her footsteps slow and deliberate. Mrs. Finch was on the front steps, sweeping away the fallen leaves, her face set in its usual no-nonsense expression. "Miss Marple, come to see the Reverend." Mrs. Finch greeted her warmly, but Miss Marple had a different question in mind. "I wanted to ask about that handkerchief," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but probing. "The one you mentioned last week, the monogrammed one." Mrs. Finch stopped, the broom stilling in her hands as she turned to face Miss Marple. "Oh, that one," she muttered, clearly uninterested in the mystery. "Never did find it. It had CD embroidered on it, you know." Came from the old donation box we send things to Little Mering once a month. Most things come with tags, but that one didn't. She shook her head, clearly irritated. Lovely linen though. Shame about the staining. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady as she pressed further. And the stains you say were blue. Soap, perhaps. Mrs. Finch sighed in frustration. Yes, soap. Dratted laundry apprentice. Couldn't get it out no matter how hard I scrubbed. Miss Marple's mind raced. The initials CD. The blue streaks. This was no longer coincidence. She thanked Mrs. Finch and made her way back down the path, her thoughts sharp and focused. The connections were beginning to emerge, one after the other, like a picture coming into sharper focus. A woman arrives in Netherbarrow, wearing gloves ordered in someone else's name, gloves from a local shop that shouldn't have been accessible to her. She attends a garden party she wasn't invited to, sits in a chair facing the orchard, and is later found dead in that very orchard. Blue powder traces the hem of her dress and her gloves. And now, a missing handkerchief, monogrammed with the initials CD, had been reported by Mrs. Finch, and blue streaks had stained it as well. Blue streaks that matched the powder. She had been laundering something, or perhaps someone else had been laundering something for her. As the evening drew in, Miss Marple felt the sharp edge of the mystery, now cutting through the village, each thread of suspicion pulling taut around her. She made her way to the Red Fern Inn, the air thick with the scent of rain, her thoughts swirling like the dark clouds overhead. Inside, Mr. Hartley, the innkeeper, greeted her with his usual tired smile. "Ah, Miss Marple, come to see the Reverend?" he asked, polishing glasses absently. "Actually," she said, her tone mild but insistent, "I was wondering if I might take a look at Miss Denham's room. I understand the police have finished with it." Hartley scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Room 5, I suppose," he said, shrugging. She kept to herself, didn't make much noise. But there's something about her, isn't there? Felt odd, like she was waiting for something, or someone. Miss Marple's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "Indeed," she murmured, her eyes already beginning to scan the room. As she entered the small tidy space, she felt the air shift around her. This room, like the rest of Netherbarrow, was a place caught between the past and the present. The secrets Clara Denham had brought with her were now closing in, and Miss Marple was poised to unravel them, one layer at a time. The clock was ticking. The mystery of Netherbarrow was far from solved, but Miss Marple knew the truth was hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The room, cloaked in a stillness that felt almost sacred, seemed preserved in the very moment its last occupant had left it. A silence so complete it pressed against the ears, as if daring any sound to disturb its secrets. Nothing had been moved since the police had taken their cursory notes, leaving behind the faint echo of unanswered questions. On the bed, resting like an afterthought yet radiating quiet significance, was a small travel bag. Miss Marple approached it with the gentle precision of someone unwrapping something both fragile and dangerous. Her fingers moved with care, brushing aside the zipper, revealing 2 meticulously folded dresses, a modest cosmetics pouch, and tucked snugly along the inner lining, a seemingly innocent laundry ticket. The slip bore the name, Miss Clara Denham, and the address Netherbarrow Laundry. Felt too local, too close, for a woman described as merely a passerby. The item listed was singular. 1 handkerchief. Linen. Embroidered. It was too little, too simple. And Miss Marple, with years of unspoken truths etched into her memory, knew that simplicity could be a disguise. Her eyes scanned deeper. Beneath the false bottom of the bag, stitched into the lining as though meant never to be found, was a second ticket. Same laundry. Different date. Different name. Mrs. M. Vale. A cold understanding seeped through Miss Marple's thoughts. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity or a borrowed name. This was deliberate, hidden, purposeful. Someone had washed away more than linen. They had laundered guilt, scrubbed it clean, pressed it flat, and tucked it behind silence. The mystery was no longer who Clara Denham had come to visit. It was who had helped her vanish into the village without a ripple, and what unspoken thing both women had tried so hard to erase. The answer, Miss Marple feared, was already soaking through the village's well-maintained surface, like water beneath varnished wood. In the days that followed, the air in Netherbarrow thickened, not with rain, but with an invisible heaviness that settled on windowsills and inside the pauses of everyday conversation. People still greeted one another with smiles, still chatted over produce and bread, but everything carried a brittle edge. Every word was cautiously selected, every glance lingered just a moment too long. At the heart of it all, unnoticed by most but seeing everything, was Miss Marple. She said nothing of the laundry slips, not yet. Revealing them too soon would scatter the puzzle, before it could be assembled. Instead, she maintained her routine, like a conductor who knows every note before the orchestra plays it. She visited the greengrocer, exchanging idle chatter about early apples. She dropped into the church to speak with the vicar's wife, nodding politely at nothing in particular. She bought one of Mr. Dobbin's famously dry scones, chewing it slowly while observing the rhythm of the village around her. It was in these small, seemingly unremarkable moments that Miss Marple noticed the unraveling. Mrs. Vale, once the queen bee of the village's social hive, outspoken, confident, immaculately dressed, always first to speak at the Women's Guild, now appeared only in fleeting glimpses. She entered shops when they were nearly empty, avoided the town square, and carried her handbag clutched tight against her chest, even indoors. Her gait was hurried, her eyes often darting toward shadows, as if afraid they might speak. He now took solitary walks at strange hours, always finding his way to the churchyard, where he'd pause with the air of a man haunted by a memory he couldn't quite confess to. Miss Marple had seen this before. These were not the quiet rhythms of grief. This was something heavier, not sadness, guilt. It wasn't until a few days later that the strings truly began to loosen. Miss Marple, carrying a pie dish under one arm and her ever-present smile under the other, arrived at the Vale household. Mrs. Vale answered, her voice barely a whisper of its former strength. "Come in, Miss Marple. I was just finishing the preserves." The kitchen was thick with the cloying scent of plum jam and over-boiled sugar. Her radio murmured faintly, its words lost beneath the silence between the two women. Miss Marple placed the dish on the counter. "I won't stay long. Just wanted to return this. The rhubarb pie was quite lovely. An old recipe, I imagine?" Mrs. Vale gave a strained smile, her eyes dim. "Yes, from my mother's side." Miss Marple's tone was light, almost airy. "You know, it's the oddest thing, laundry tickets. Such tiny scraps. And yet they tell such personal stories. I found one the other day, tucked away at the inn. It had your name on it." Mrs. Vale's hand froze mid-air, the spoon dripping jam into an already full jar. She didn't breathe. Miss Marple didn't look up. Curious, I thought. And then another appeared. Same laundry, days apart. But this one bore the name Clara Denham. She turned then, meeting Mrs. Vale's eyes. It made me wonder, what reason would a visitor have to use the name of someone local? Or more puzzling, why would she have your laundry in the first place? There was a pause so deep it swallowed the room. The only sound was the soft fizz of jam bubbling on the stove. Mrs. Vale sat down hard, as if her legs had suddenly forgotten how to hold her. Her face was pale, drained, as though the effort of hiding a truth had finally begun to consume her. And Miss Marple knew, without a shadow of doubt, that the truth she was about to hear would not just reveal the story of a stranger's brief visit. It would expose the fragile, festering heart of something much older, much darker, that had been buried long before Clara Denham ever arrived in Netherbarrow. She came to me on a night soaked in thunder, the air so heavy with rain and secrets, that even the walls seemed to listen. Her knock on the door was faint, hesitant, almost like a final plea rather than a request. When I opened it, Clara stood there soaked through, her coat clinging to her like second skin, eyes wide and haunted, as if she had seen something no one should. "I can't go to him," she rasped, voice brittle with exhaustion and something darker. Not yet. Not like this. She stepped inside slowly, movements heavy with dread, and in her trembling hands was a bundle. Old clothes folded carefully, a delicate handkerchief stained faintly at the corner, gloves that looked borrowed, not hers. She said she thought there might be something on them. Dust, powder, something invisible but dangerous. She wasn't sure, only that they needed to be cleaned. It's not just laundry, she murmured. It's part of something I can't talk about yet. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and her eyes darted to the shadows like someone being followed. I should have asked questions, but I didn't. Maybe because part of me was afraid of the answers, or maybe because I assumed wrongly that it was some private affair, a scandal, something to do with the Colonel's past. Everyone knew whispers surrounded the Colonel's first wife, Eleanor, that her death, though deemed accidental, always carried a bitter aftertaste of secrecy. I thought perhaps Clara had stumbled on something best left untouched. But then, after she died, I panicked. I lied. I told the police I hadn't seen her at the party, hadn't exchanged a word, but that wasn't true. I had seen her, spoken to her, helped her, and now she was gone. Miss Marple, quiet as dusk but sharp as glass, looked at me with those steady, all-knowing eyes. You were protecting yourself, she said softly, and maybe someone else too. Her words hit like a cold breeze down the spine. I hesitated, heart pounding, before finally confessing. She came for him, I said. She said he didn't know yet. Not Jeffrey. She had to speak to him first, but she wasn't sure she'd get the chance. She told me there were things buried with Eleanor, things that someone was willing to do anything to keep hidden. And then I remembered the strangest part, the thing that still chills me. Before she left that night, she said something cryptic. She said, "It's time the truth faced north." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, just slightly. He always made the chair face that way, I added. Said it was so Eleanor could still see everything. That's when something in Miss Marple's face shifted. She was no longer just listening. She was assembling a puzzle, only she could see. Without another word, she rose and left, her steps purposeful, her mind razor-sharp. The chair, the borrowed gloves, the direction, the name Clara Denham. Clara hadn't come merely to visit. She had come to bring the truth, and now she was dead. And it wasn't just her death the village was burying. It was everything she represented. As Miss Marple walked through the village green, dusk settling around her like a cloak, she passed young Miles Hargreaves. He looked nervous, eyes flitting toward her with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Miss Marple," he blurted, "I heard you've been asking about Clara." "Just listening, dear," she said gently. "I didn't recognize her at first," he continued, words spilling out. "She used to visit when I was a boy. Then, nothing. She just vanished." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. Sometimes people return because the past refuses to stay buried. Miles hesitated, then asked in a hushed voice, "Is it true that she was ill? Grief can shatter a person in ways you can't see." Miss Marple replied, "But Clara wasn't broken. She came with purpose. She came to piece something together, something that someone wanted kept apart." He swallowed hard. Do you think she was murdered?" Miss Marple turned her eyes toward the north-facing chair, now eerily empty once more. "I think someone feared what she might reveal," she said quietly. "And fear, my dear, drives people to do terrible, irreversible things." The envelope was old, its edges yellowed with age, sealed shut by a precise circle of hardened wax. No name, no date, only two delicate black-inked initials. E.H., as if written not to inform but to haunt. It first found its way to Reverend Alcott, the village chaplain, who examined it with a frown, not daring to open it. There was something about the wax, too brittle, too deliberate, that unsettled him. After a brief hesitation, he sent word to Inspector Rowlings. By dusk the letter had reached the quiet sitting room of Miss Adelaide Hawthorne, where Inspector Rowlings laid it carefully between them on the table. The room smelled faintly of dried roses, parchment and time itself. "I shouldn't be showing you this," he said quietly, "but I have a feeling you already suspect what it might contain." Miss Hawthorne adjusted her spectacles and studied the seal. "Eleanor Hargrove," she murmured. Rowlings gave a slow nod. "Colonel Hargrove's first wife. Died 15 years ago. That part is not in dispute. But the nature of her death has always been quietly debated." Miss Hawthorne finished, her voice low and even. Rowlings broke the seal, unfolding the single sheet within. The handwriting was unmistakably feminine, graceful, deliberate. No margins, no embellishments, just the raw need to be understood. "If anything should happen to me, this letter is to be given to Clara Denham, not Geoffrey. Not the police. Clara will know what to do. My death may be an accident. Or it may not. Geoffrey's temper has grown darker, more erratic. There are things he refuses to discuss. The locked study, his father's papers, our recent arguments. If I fall, it will not be by chance." A heavy silence followed. "She wrote this before she died," Rowling said grimly. "And someone hid it. In the church vestry. A place meant for confession and concealment," Miss Hawthorne murmured. "Perhaps Clara herself hid it. Perhaps she returned later, searching for it. But someone had already found it first. Clara came to Netherbarrow asking questions," Rowlings added. "She knew enough to be suspicious, but not enough to accuse. This letter might have been her proof. The proof she never managed to reclaim." Rowlings exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. "This changes things. We now have motive. A clear one. But for what crime?" Miss Hawthorne asked gently. "Clara Denham wasn't pushed from a balcony. She died quietly. No marks. No signs of struggle. And yet, she died." Before Rowlings could respond, a sudden knock came at the door. Sergeant Bell. "Apologies, sir. But you'll want to see this." They followed him through fog-laced streets to Hazel Dean House, where Theodora Hargrove waited in the drawing room, visibly shaken. In her hands she clutched something. An old photograph, worn at the corners like a secret handled too many times. "I found it in Geoffrey's desk," she whispered. "This evening. I don't know how I've missed it all these years." She handed it to Rowlings. The image was faded but clear enough. 3 figures beneath a twisted tree, a younger Colonel Hargrove at the center, flanked by 2 women. One was unmistakably Eleanor. The other, slimmer, younger, her eyes veiled in guarded sorrow, was Clara Denham. They were all smiling, but none of the smiles felt honest. "There's something written on the back," Theodora added. "That's what unsettled me." Rowlings turned the photo over. 3 faces. 1 truth. "The tree remembers all." He frowned. "Cryptic." Miss Hawthorne took the photo, but her eyes didn't linger on the faces. Instead they fixed on a faint silhouette, just behind the tree, a 4th shape, hidden in shadow. "Watching. Always watching." "This isn't a photograph," she said slowly. "It's a testimony. A silent witness to a crime long buried, and now awakened." The yew tree still stood, ancient and gnarled at the edge of the estate, a looming sentinel rooted in secrets too heavy for time to carry alone. "It's still on the property, isn't it?" Miss Whitmore asked, her voice a hushed thread in the chilly air. Theodora nodded slowly, eyes distant. "Yes, at the northern boundary. It's over 100 years old. Geoffrey says it was planted by an ancestor during Queen Victoria's reign, as part of the family's legacy." Without another word, Miss Whitmore rose, her movements quiet but resolute. "Walk with me, dear." They stepped out through the side veranda, their silhouettes swallowed by the damp mist that clung to the lawn like a breath held too long. The cold seemed to whisper warnings, brushing against them like fingers from the past. There, rising from the earth like a memory carved in bark, stood the yew, twisted immovable. Its limbs curled like ancient secrets, refusing to die. Miss Whitmore approached it carefully, reverently, her gaze soft. "In older times," she whispered, Yew trees were planted near graves. People believed their roots could carry memories, that the dead spoke through them. Her foot traced a jagged section of disturbed soil at the base, recently shifted. Theodora's breath caught. That wasn't there before. No, Miss Whitmore replied, crouching. It's shallow. Not done by a gardener. Someone was hiding something, not planting. She gently brushed the loose dirt away, and beneath it, a glint of rusted metal. A tin box, locked, heavy. Her fingers trembled as she took it. Clara once said. The tree remembered. I think this is what she meant. Crail appeared then, summoned by urgency. He forced the lock, and inside letters, dozens of them, worn and yellowed, tied with string. All from Eleanor to Clara. Each letter a shard of a long-buried truth. Accusations, patterns of manipulation, emotional torment, and quiet desperation. Beneath the stack lay a final envelope, marked in Eleanor's fragile handwriting. To be opened only in death. Crail read it silently, his face paling with every line. She knew, he whispered. She documented everything. The abuse, the threats, the pressure to keep silent. She feared for her life. Theodora's hand flew to her mouth. Geoffrey told me she'd slipped, that she was dizzy, that the railing gave way. Miss Whitmore touched her arm gently. It may have. But Eleanor prepared for the fall. She knew what was coming. Crail closed the box with solemn care. And Clara, she returned to find this. She must have known it was buried here. But someone stopped her, made sure she never spoke. Miss Whitmore nodded, her voice like wind in a crypt. Someone ensured her silence was final. That night, Hazeldene House didn't sleep. The windows stayed shut, the halls eerily quiet. Yet the very walls seemed tense, bracing for revelations they'd long tried to forget. The discovery beneath the yew had cracked something open. Not just a mystery, but a legacy of silence and guilt. Crail moved now with fierce resolve, no longer waiting for facts to rise, but chasing whispers, patterns, ghosts. And Miss Whitmore, as always, was listening. She walked the village the next morning, with purpose cloaked in calm, speaking little, absorbing much, from the postmistress's quiet recollections to Reverend Alcott's housekeeper's fleeting mention of a long-forgotten incident. When she returned, it was with a small object wrapped in brown paper, and tied with string. At precisely 4 p.m., she requested a gathering at Hazeldene. Theodora, Colonel Hargrove, Miles, Mrs. Vale, and an unamused but intrigued Inspector Crail. In the drawing-room, the fire crackled quietly. A silver tray of untouched tea sat between them. Miss Whitmore, knitting in her lap, regarded them with calm grace. I've called you here, she began softly, because we are very near the truth. And truth, I've learned, does not shout. It whispers, softly, patiently, waiting for someone to listen. The air inside the drawing-room seemed to thicken with every breath, as though the walls themselves were holding in a long-forgotten truth, waiting for someone brave enough to speak it aloud. Miss Althea Grantham, usually calm and distant, set her knitting aside with a slow, deliberate motion. Her fingers, though aged and gentle, moved with quiet purpose, as she reached into the brown paper bundle resting in her lap, and withdrew a small, unremarkable glass bottle, squat and clear with a narrow neck that caught the light just enough to glint ominously. I found this tossed carelessly into the apothecary's waste, she began, her voice quiet but piercing. It may not look like much, but the residue inside tells another story. Digitalis, derived from the foxglove plant. In small measured doses, it can help the heart, but in higher quantities, it becomes a silent killer, especially for someone already weak. Her words landed with an eerie stillness, rippling through the room like a slow-moving chill. Inspector Crail leaned forward instinctively, the flicker of realization starting to form behind his eyes. Colonel Bramley, seated stiffly across the room, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands curling slightly against the armrests, as though bracing for an impact he could already sense. Miss Althea's gaze scanned the room, finally settling on the quiet, shadowed figure of Mrs. Redwick, the housekeeper who had until now blended into the wallpaper of the estate's daily life. But tonight there was nowhere left to hide. "You were the last person to see Miss Danforth alive," Althea said, her voice now layered with something firmer, not accusation, but certainty. "She trusted you with her belongings. Did she also trust you with her fears? Did she say anything about what she discovered? About who she feared?" Mrs. Redwick looked down at her folded hands, the silence around her now too loud to ignore. "She mentioned a letter, a locked drawer. She said someone close to her, someone once dear, had changed. That she didn't know who to trust anymore." The tension in the room shifted. Something unseen had been disturbed. Then, without hesitation, Miss Althea pulled out an old photograph from her handbag. Its edges were worn, its surface faded by time. 3 figures stood beneath a large, curved U-shaped tree. A boy, a woman and a third person, their face just slightly obscured. Her eyes turned slowly to the quietest man in the room. "Miles," she said softly, her voice now almost a whisper. "You recognized her the moment she arrived. Clara Danforth. She wasn't just a distant relative. She was your mother's cousin, a living reminder of the truth your father buried long ago." Miles didn't speak, didn't blink. His stillness said more than words ever could. "She asked to speak to your father, but she also spoke to you. She told you about the letters, about the past, about the scandal. She said she would reveal everything, and you knew what that meant. Disgrace, financial ruin, the collapse of everything your father built." Althea's eyes didn't leave his. "But you didn't act out of malice. You acted out of fear. And when fear and desperation meet, that's when choices are made that can never be undone." A pause. The silence deepened. "You ordered the gloves for her, didn't you?" she continued. "They were too specific, too new. I thought she used your name for protection. But no, you wanted her to fit in, to avoid suspicion, to feel safe. But the moment she threatened the fragile image you were clinging to, your fear became something else. And so you helped her to tea, and you helped her heart to slow, just enough that she slipped away, quietly, without protest. No visible pain, just silence." The weight of those words pressed down on everyone like gravity. Miles said nothing, but the way his chest rose and fell now, uneven, shallow, told the rest of the story. Inspector Crail stood slowly, the moment heavy with understanding rather than fury. Justice would come later. For now the truth itself was its own verdict. Miss Althea looked back toward the photograph in her hand, her voice suddenly gentle again. "The truth has been hidden beneath that old yew tree for years, buried beneath reputation, medals and silence. But tonight, at last, it has come to light." As the wind whispered through the tall hedges outside, casting dancing shadows into the drawing room, a stillness settled thick as fog, the kind that followed the unmasking of long-hidden sins. Miles Hargreaves didn't argue, didn't flee, didn't cry for innocence. He simply lowered his head, not with guilt alone, but with the weight of every unspoken fear that had haunted him since Clara Danforth had stepped back into their lives. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he murmured, voice heavy with shame. "I just wanted her to stop." But the truth once set in motion, does not stop. It carves its path through silence and denial, until it finds its place. Miss Eliza Marchant, seated in the corner where the light barely reached, closed her eyes, as if hearing the distant echo of a past long denied, then whispered, "Truth always finds its place, even when the world tries to bury it beneath decorum and dust." Inspector Braithwaite placed a steady hand on Miles' shoulder. No handcuffs yet, only the invisible chains of consequence tightening with every breath. The others slowly drifted from the room, but the air remained charged, alive with the ghost of Clara's final moments and the storm she had stirred. Colonel Hargreaves, unmoved in his high-backed chair, stared ahead as though seeing beyond the walls, into a time when truth could still be avoided. But Eliza had been watching him. His eyes held no shock, only the worn defeat of a man who had long feared that buried truths might one day surface in the form of a girl with eyes too familiar, and questions too sharp. Clara didn't come to destroy you, Eliza said gently. She came to offer peace, to acknowledge what was once denied, and perhaps forgive what could not be undone. The colonel's voice, rough with age and regret, broke the silence. She was too loyal, even to those who didn't deserve it. Eliza leaned forward, her words quiet but cutting. She wasn't loyal to people, Colonel. She was loyal to truth. That's not the same thing. The room had emptied now, leaving only the two of them, the chill of untaken tea between them. Outside, early petals floated to the earth like forgotten memories. I never pushed Eleanor, he said suddenly, almost pleading. It was raining. She was drinking. She slipped. Eliza nodded. Not in agreement but in acknowledgement. Perhaps, but fear, Colonel, doesn't need a shove. Sometimes it only needs silence, pressure, and the slow crumbling of spirit to drive a person to the edge. She believed her fear was real. That's what matters. His jaw tightened, his gaze hollow. She made me feel small. She never said anything, but she had a way of stripping me down with a look. And Clara, she had the same eyes. Eliza rose, her voice softening, though her words held steel. Clara didn't get the answers she came for, but you still have the chance to speak them. If not to the world, then at least to yourself. Truth is still waiting, Colonel, and it's patient. With that she left him, alone in the chair, where Eleanor once read her Sunday papers, where laughter once lived before silence took its place. The past had returned not with screams or vengeance, but with quiet reckoning. And now at last, it demanded to be heard. The evening crept in with a slow, deliberate calm, the air heavy with the weight of untold secrets and long-held truths that had begun to emerge, still trembling at the edges of the village. As Miss Langley stepped back into her home, the kettle sat cooling on the stove, its soft hiss long faded, while the cat lounged lazily in the window, watching the world as it exhaled, shifting from anxious stillness to a reluctant sense of release. The village outside, while breathing once more, did so with trepidation, like a storm-ravaged landscape finally exhaling after the chaos had subsided. But the questions, they had not gone. They remained, hanging thick in the air, and Miss Langley knew she could not rest yet. Her feet led her, almost unconsciously, back to the orchard, where the chair still sat on the lawn, unchanged and undisturbed, facing the northern gate. It had not moved. She lowered herself into it once more, settling into the quiet peace it offered, but not the kind of peace that heals. No, this was the kind that demands answers, the kind that watches and waits. From this vantage point, she could see everything, not just the orchard, but the yew tree standing tall at the edge of the property, its branches casting long shadows over the ground. It was the perfect place for reflection, but even more so for watching. As she closed her eyes, her mind began to retrace the quiet steps of Clara Wentworth's final arrival into their midst. Clara had come without disguise, without a veil of secrecy, lodging openly at the Red Fern Inn, her presence unfettered, her mind set on one purpose. She arrived early at the garden party, slipping quietly through the orchard, choosing the north-facing chair, almost as though she knew it would be the one that would bear witness. But why? Miss Langley's thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps. Mrs. Wilder, hesitant, stood at the edge of the path, her face drawn with concern. "Forgive me," she said quietly. "I didn't realize anyone was out here." Miss Langley turned with a small, kind smile. "Just enjoying the stillness," she said, her voice soothing. Mrs. Wilder took a few steps closer, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest, as though shielding herself from something invisible. "I keep thinking, I should have stopped her. When Clara said she was going to confront the colonel, I should have known better. I should have stopped her from speaking out." Miss Langley met her gaze, unwavering. "You did what you could," she said softly. "You helped her when she believed she had evidence, when she thought she had something to hold on to. You gave her a fleeting moment of comfort in a storm of fear. And that, Mrs. Wilde, was enough." Mrs. Wilder shifted, her eyes blinking rapidly as emotion welled up. "And Miles?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. "What happens to him now?" Miss Langley's tone was quiet but firm. "He will answer for his actions, though he will do so, knowing the truth sought him out in the end, not the other way around." As they turned back toward the house, the sun dipped low, casting long, stretching shadows over the lawn, a quiet foreboding settling over them. Miss Langley rose slowly from the chair, brushing the grass from her skirt. "That," she murmured, "is the truest form of justice. Not vengeance, but memory. A remembrance that can never be erased." The wind shifted slightly as they walked, the chair creaking softly in its place behind them, still facing north. It wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a reminder, an ever-present sentinel of all that had been, and all that still lingered. 2 days later, the official inquiry into Clara Wentworth's death was reopened. The coroner, previously content with a diagnosis of natural causes, now had new evidence to examine. Toxicology reports confirmed what Miss Langley had suspected all along. Traces of digitalis had been found in Clara's blood. It hadn't been a swift or violent poison, but a subtle one, slow enough to escape immediate notice, administered carefully over time, perhaps in tea, or in a single concentrated dose, just enough to slow her heart and dim her senses. Inspector Hargrave, ever composed, laid the facts before the village, but it was Miss Langley, sitting quietly near the window in the village hall, who truly tied the pieces together for those who still could not make sense of the tragedy. She didn't stand behind a lectern, or raise her voice with dramatic flair. Instead she sat, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, answering the questions as they came, each response measured, deliberate. "Why would Miles do such a thing?" Reverend Harding asked, his voice filled with confusion. "She was family." Miss Langley's eyes flickered briefly to the window, her voice soft but sure. "Yes, she was family. But family at times can become the very thing that threatens to unravel everything." With those words the villagers, still reeling from the shock, began to understand. Not only had Clara been a victim of poison, but of betrayal, the ties of family twisting until they choked the very life from her. And in the end, it was not just the truth of her death that mattered, but the memory she left behind. The evening hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. It was as if the very ground beneath the village had become aware of the events that had just transpired, events that would forever alter its quiet existence. The once familiar sounds of the countryside felt muted now, as if the land itself had absorbed the tension, waiting for something to shift. Miss Marple, sitting in her favorite chair by the orchard, watched as the world outside seemed to hold its breath. The breeze moved lazily through the trees, but the air was thick, pressing on her chest as though secrets that had been buried deep were finally coming to the surface, stirring everything they touched. Her thoughts were heavy, tracing the path that had led them here, where Clara's life and her tragic end had revealed a truth so uncomfortable that the village had been forced to face it. Clara had been a woman who walked on the fringes of society, never fully embraced by it, and in the end, it had been this very isolation that allowed her death to be quietly manipulated. But it wasn't just her murder that had disturbed the peace, it was the shadow of the Hargreaves family name, a name Miles had worked his entire life to preserve. That name, once synonymous with dignity and respect, had become a gilded cage, a false construct. Clara hadn't sought vengeance. She had simply sought to bring the truth to light, to make sure that her sister, Eleanor, wouldn't be forgotten. Her death swept under the rug, her story swallowed by time. Miles, caught between his own ambitions and the past that Clara had unearthed, had resorted to the poison, the slow creeping poison that had first clouded Clara's mind, and then quieted her heart. The poison had been subtle, administered in small doses, over weeks, until Clara's health had deteriorated so far that her symptoms seemed more like the result of natural causes. Her headaches, her dizzy spells, the palpitations, no one had thought twice. The world was too busy to notice the creeping shadow that had already claimed her life, and by the time it was too late, It was clear that the quiet conspiracy of silence had worked. But Clara had a different idea about silence. She was no longer willing to let the past remain buried. And in that final act of defiance, she had laid out the evidence, meticulously, carefully, as though she knew it wouldn't be enough to save her. She was not looking for retribution. No, her heart longed for justice, not revenge. Her final actions were a declaration, a reminder that truth always finds its way, no matter how long it takes. Miss Marple knew that the village's quiet facade had cracked, but it wasn't broken. They would continue their daily lives, their routines, but something would shift forever. Clara's death, though tragic, had become a moment of reckoning for them all. The very fabric of the village, its sense of peace, its sense of safety, had been disrupted, but not violently. It had been quietly, irrevocably torn. The truth had bled into the ground, unnoticed by most but felt by all. And the one person who had always been aware of it, Miss Marple, had once again been the observer, the one who had noticed the small things, the things others chose to ignore. And then, of course, there was the matter of Miles. Miss Marple had always known that he was not above the law, that his family's name would not shield him from the consequences of his actions. The village had hoped for justice to be swift, but they had forgotten the power of time, the way it worked to reshape the truth, to make it more palatable for the world to swallow. Miles would not face the law for his crime, but Miss Marple knew that the truth would be his punishment. For Miles had lived with the weight of his guilt long before Clara had died. He had known the truth all along, and perhaps that had been the greatest burden of all. The wind shifted slightly, as though the earth itself had taken a breath, and Miss Marple stood, her hand brushing the seat of the chair. It had been a place of quiet reflection for her, but it was also a place of observation. She had watched as the threads of the village's hidden story wove themselves together. Clara's death had been the spark, but the fire was only just beginning to smolder beneath the surface. As she walked back to the house, the air felt charged with an intensity that hadn't been there before. The village would never be the same. Miss Marple knew this as she entered the home, the door clicking shut behind her. The past had a way of finding people, of revealing itself when they least expected it, and in that moment, the village had been forever changed. Not by a single death, but by the revelation that had followed it. The secrets they had kept, the lies they had woven together, could no longer hold their shape. Something had been set into motion, and Miss Marple, as always, would be the quiet witness to the ripples it would create. The quiet corners of Nether Barrow had once felt like the embrace of an untouched past, but now they seemed to hum with a nervous tension, as though the very ground beneath their feet was no longer solid. Clara had walked this familiar path countless times before, but today the air felt thick, as if it carried a weight that had been too long ignored. The orchard, once a place of solace, now seemed to stretch farther than she remembered, the hedgerows and ivy-covered fences whispering of untold stories. The sky, heavy with clouds, loomed over her, casting everything in a muted grey light. At the northern edge of the property stood the tree, crooked and ancient, untouched by time, as though guarding secrets buried beneath its roots. The chair facing it for years remained untouched too, but today she felt compelled to sit one last time. She sank into it, the creaking wood beneath her, an eerie reminder of all that had been left unsaid, and as she rested her hands in her lap, a thought crept into her mind. This had never been just about death. It had always been about silence. A silence too long kept, a silence that had cracked under the weight of forgotten truths. The laughter of children, faint but distinct, floated over the garden, a bittersweet sound of life stirring once more in the wake of revelation. And yet, Miss Marple thought, not every truth led to triumph. Some truths merely existed, in all their raw, unsettling clarity, and that perhaps was enough. The days that followed Miles Hargreaves' confession were oddly subdued, the relief that had once flooded the village quickly dissipating, leaving behind an uneasy quiet that clung to the air like mist. Nether Barrow had always been a place of predictable rhythms, where the past was a distant whisper, safely tucked away in forgotten corners. But now, Even the most idyllic facades seemed to tremble with the weight of their own secrets. As Miss Marple took her usual walk through the village lanes, there was a slowness to her steps, as though the ground beneath her was no longer as steady, no longer as reassuring as it once was. When she entered the bakery, the familiar smell of fresh bread greeted her, but it did little to ease the unease that had settled in her chest. Mr. Dobbins, still behind the counter, looked older somehow, his eyes shadowed by a worry that hadn't been there before. "Do you think it will ever feel the same again?" he asked in a low voice, as though the question itself carried the weight of 100 unspoken fears. Miss Marple paused, placing a loaf of bread on the counter, her fingers brushing the rough surface of the wood. "Things never feel the same after a truth comes to light," she replied quietly. "But in time people adjust. The weight of guilt shifts, slowly, almost imperceptibly." He nodded, but there was a distant look in his eyes, as if his mind was lost in the echoes of regret. "I keep wondering," he murmured, "if things had been different, if we'd just said something sooner." Miss Marple's gaze softened as she met his eyes. "Regret," she said, "has a strange way of showing up, often when it's too late to change the past." The bell above the door jingled, and Mrs. Petherbridge entered, her face pale, her steps hesitant. She greeted Miss Marple with a half-hearted smile, her usual briskness faltering. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "about the Hargreaves family, about everything that happened. The Colonel, I don't know if I can look at him the same way again." Miss Marple regarded her silently, understanding in her eyes. "He will always carry the weight of what was left unspoken, just as we all carry the weight of what we couldn't have known." Mrs. Petherbridge wrung her hands, her gaze distant. "I don't know why I feel this way. We weren't close friends, but he's been here so long, and we all accepted the story. Now it's like the ground's been pulled from under us. What we thought we knew wasn't the truth." Miss Marple nodded, her expression calm but knowing. "No," she agreed softly, "it was not." As Mrs. Petherbridge left, Miss Marple turned to Mr. Dobbins, who had been listening quietly. "Do you think," he asked slowly, "that any of us would have done things differently if we'd known? Could we have stopped it?" Miss Marple gave him a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Hindsight makes fine company," she said gently. "But I suspect none of us could have stopped the course of events. Some truths," she paused, her voice lowering, "have a way of unraveling no matter how tightly we try to weave them." Outside, the sky darkened further, the storm on the horizon now a palpable threat, ready to break. The village had changed, its facade shattered, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The village, still heavy with the tension of recent revelations, seemed to hold its breath as the storm loomed just beyond the horizon, a silent promise of things to come. The oppressive stillness had wrapped itself around every corner of Nether Barrow, clinging to the cobbled streets and the facades of its neat cottages, where whispers of the past week's unsettling truths refused to fade. Miss Marple, loaf in hand and marmalade jar carefully tucked under her arm, made her way toward the green where a small cluster of villagers had gathered, their heads bowed beneath the looming shadow of the church. She noticed the way the air felt, charged, as if each step taken by the villagers was a tentative surrender to the discomfort they could no longer avoid. Upon her arrival at her cottage, Miss Marple found Mrs. Entwistle waiting by the garden gate, her fingers twisting the edges of her shawl in an agitated manner. The older woman's voice trembled with anxiety as she spoke. "I heard they're sending Miles away." Miss Marple nodded slowly, understanding the weight of the words. "Yes, my dear," she replied softly. "He will be taken to a facility where he will have time to reflect. But the true punishment, the one that will remain, is the one he must carry within himself." Mrs. Entwistle's eyes clouded with doubt. "But he's so young, Miss Marple. How could he—" She trailed off, unable to voice the unspeakable horror that had come to light. Miss Marple placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, her voice calm yet unwavering. "We all have shadows, Mrs. Entwistle. Some of us simply don't know how to confront them. And when they finally break free, they don't always leave behind what we expect." The conversation hung in the air, laden with the weight of truths too difficult to bear. That evening, as the last remnants of the storm passed, Miss Marple sat by her window, the soft light from the lamps casting long shadows across the room. The scent of damp earth hung in the air, a reminder of the storm's passing. Outside, the village was a world transformed, wet, glistening under the fading light, but also heavy with the knowledge that some things had changed irrevocably. The confession of Miles Hargreaves had opened a wound that could never fully heal. Though justice had been served in the traditional sense, there was a deeper fracture now visible within the very fabric of the community. It was the kind of wound that left a mark on the soul, one that would remain long after the physical scars had faded. The villagers had seen the cracks that had been so carefully hidden from view, and in facing them, they had been forced to confront not only the sins of one man but the uncomfortable truths about themselves and their society. Miss Marple closed her eyes, her mind quietly processing the complex web of emotions surrounding the events. Sometimes, she thought truth wasn't meant to be a source of comfort, but of understanding. And for some, that was all they could ever hope for. The village would recover, but it would never be the same. The people too would carry the knowledge of what had happened, and in time, perhaps a measure of redemption would come, not through forgiveness, but through the slow and steady acceptance of what had been done. She smiled softly to herself. She knew how people adjusted to their truths, how they learned to live with the weight of what had been revealed, and though it was never easy, it was always necessary. The village, like the chair that faced north, had now seen the truth, and it would never be the same again. The morning after the storm, Nether Barrow was bathed in the cold, sharp light of the sun, the streets glistening as though scrubbed clean of the previous day's sorrow. Even the air around the Hargreaves estate seemed to lift, though the heaviness of the past was far from forgotten. The villagers moved through their routines with muted effort, as if still unsure of how to approach the world, now that the truth had laid itself bare before them. Miss Marple, standing at her window, watched the village return to its familiar rhythm. Yet it was different now. The echoes of the past week lingered, threading through every whispered conversation, every glance exchanged. She saw Theodora Hargreaves walking down the cobbled lane, her step firmer, more resolute than it had been in days. The village was quieter, yes, but more awake, more aware. Even as life seemed to continue, there was an unspoken recognition that something had irrevocably shifted. Miles Hargreaves, once a boy of promise, now faced the full weight of his actions, the consequences unfolding in ways that no one had ever anticipated. The letter from Eleanor had sealed his fate, and he was gone. But in the absence of his presence, the villagers were left to confront the deeper unspoken truths they had been avoiding for so long. They would never again be the same. The storm had passed, but its aftermath would haunt them all in ways they could not yet comprehend. The village might recover, but the cracks would remain, subtle yet permanent, reminding them always of the price of truth, and the cost of silence. The village of Nether Barrow had always been a quiet place, nestled in the rolling hills like a secret kept between the earth and the sky. The fog that had rolled in that morning, thick and unyielding, seemed to swallow the streets whole, blanketing everything in an eerie silence. Even the old stone walls, which had stood witness to centuries of lives unfolding, seemed to sag beneath the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded here. Miss Marple stood at her window, her sharp eyes scanning the street below. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of her teacup, the warmth of the porcelain grounding her in the midst of the swirling storm inside her mind. It had been days since the truth about Clara Hargreaves' death had come to light. Days since the Hargreaves family had been torn apart by their own secrets. But still, the village could not escape the heavy cloud of guilt that now hung over it. Life had continued. Yes, but it was different now. The smile that had once graced the faces of the villagers seemed strained, as if each person wore the burden of knowing too much about the darkness hidden in their midst. They had all been forced to confront the ugly truth about the Hargreaves family, but the repercussions of that revelation were far more far-reaching than any of them had imagined. Miss Marple's mind wandered back to the moment when she had first suspected something was amiss. It was the smallest of details that had caught her attention. A faint change in the way the Hargreaves family carried themselves, a hesitation in their speech, a look exchanged between them that spoke volumes without saying a word. She had watched them for days, and as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, she realized that the answer was much darker than she had anticipated. Clara's death had not been an accident. It was a tragedy born of long-held secrets and buried resentments, a tragedy that had been hidden beneath the polished veneer of respectability that the Hargreaves family had so carefully cultivated. And now, as the dust settled, there was no going back. The truth had been uncovered, and with it the painful reality that justice had come too late to heal the wounds that had been inflicted. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Miss Marple's keen ears had heard the tread of footsteps outside long before the knock had come, and as she moved to answer, she felt a quiet tension in the air. She knew who it was before the door even opened. Inspector Crail stood there, his neat uniform somehow more rumpled than usual, his eyes shadowed with the weight of the case that had haunted him for weeks. He held a folded letter in his hand, the official seal of the investigation still intact. The letter, Miss Marple knew, was the final piece of the puzzle, the letter that would confirm what they all knew but had not yet dared to say aloud. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and weary, "I thought you should know. The investigation is officially closed." He stepped inside, his eyes avoiding hers for a moment before meeting her gaze, as though searching for something in her expression that might give him a sense of closure. Miss Marple nodded, her face as serene as ever. She had expected this, of course. The investigation had been a labyrinth of twists and turns, but in the end, it had led them to the inevitable conclusion. No more questions, no more false leads. It was over. The letter he handed her was formal, full of the dry language of bureaucracy. But Miss Marple had no need to read the words. She knew what it said. The investigation was closed. Miles Hargreaves had been exonerated, but the toll on him and his family was immeasurable. The truth had come out, and now they would live with the consequences. She unfolded the letter carefully, her eyes scanning the words with an air of quiet understanding. The official statement mentioned the Hargreaves family, the stress they had endured, and the personal toll the investigation had taken on Colonel Hargreaves. But there was little to say about the true cost of the truth. The damage had been done. "You'll find," Miss Marple said, folding the letter with great care, "that justice rarely delivers satisfaction in a place like Nether Barrow. Some truths are far too bitter to swallow, even when they are laid bare for all to see." Her voice was calm, but there was a depth to it that reflected a lifetime of observing the human condition, understanding its flaws and frailties. She had seen it all before: families torn apart by secrets, reputations shattered, lives ruined by a single misstep. And yet, there was something about this case, something about the Hargreaves family, that had unsettled her in a way she hadn't anticipated. The village had changed. Yes, but it was more than that. The very fabric of their lives had been shaken to its core, and Miss Marple knew that the ripples of this scandal would continue to spread far beyond the confines of Nether Barrow. Crail stood in silence for a moment, his expression one of deep contemplation. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Marple," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of the case. "This one, it got under my skin in ways I didn't expect. I've worked on plenty of investigations, but this one, it feels different." Miss Marple's eyes softened, a knowing glint in them. "Most mysteries do," she replied. "They don't always give us the answers we want, only the ones we need." Her words hung in the air like a quiet truth, one that both Crail and Miss Marple had come to understand over the years. Crail sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not sure what the future holds for the Hargreaves family," he murmured. "They've lost more than their reputation in this. They've lost their sense of self." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window, as she reflected on the deep personal consequences of the investigation. "Some losses can't be measured by reputation alone," she said softly. "What Colonel Hargreaves and his son will face now goes deeper than public disgrace. It's the loss of their very identity. The truth has taken that from them, and it cannot be restored." Crail nodded, a look of quiet resignation in his eyes. "You're right," he said, his voice distant. Miss Marple rose from her chair, the slow, deliberate movement betraying a quiet strength. "Life will continue, Inspector," she said, her voice steady. The chair will still face north, and new truths will take root, no matter how long it takes for them to be seen. The world doesn't stop for guilt, no matter how heavy it is. Crail hesitated at the door, his brow furrowing as if seeking an answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. Do you think they'll ever find peace? He asked. The Hargreaves. Will they ever forgive themselves? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, the wisdom of a lifetime behind her gaze. Forgiveness is a delicate thing, Inspector, she replied. It doesn't come from the outside, it comes from within. Whether they find it is up to them. But peace is a different thing altogether. Sometimes we settle for something close enough to it, even when it feels out of reach. As Crail left, Miss Marple returned to her chair, folding the letter and tucking it away. The quiet of the room enveloped her once more. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows over the village. The day was fading, but the memory of the events that had unfolded would linger long after. Miss Marple's mind wandered, tracing the quiet path of the village. The old chair that had witnessed so much. Life, like the chair that faced north, would continue to move forward, unyielding and silent, and perhaps in time, the wounds would heal, though the scars would remain. For even in truth, there was no true resolution, only the acceptance of what had been. And so, with a final quiet exhale, Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest of smiles, knowing that some mysteries were never meant to be fully understood, only endured.